Hello everyone, welcome to part 2 of the Acrylic Technique tutorial. What you need to do is get this photocopied sheet, sheet number 2, and then get a second piece of canvas. Transfer over just using a pencil. Make sure you have 8 squares. Copy down the titles of each of the techniques, 9 through 16, starting with modeling paste. And just like the last tutorial, I did some underpainting. But unlike the last tutorial, I chose a few different colors. Underpainting can be any color. The great masters of the Renaissance always used like a burnt sienna, but we can use any colors. You can see I've used some pinks and blues and different values of blue and different greens. So go ahead and do some underpainting for all 8 squares, starting with number 9 through 16. Let your underpainting dry, and then we'll get started. Let's do the modeling paste technique first, okay? You're going to need some of this modeling paste, and it's on the cart. It's labeled modeling paste, and it looks like this. Be careful because it looks just like the gloss gel, but read it. The flexible modeling paste is the one you want, and I've labeled it on the top. You're going to scoop some of this out. So you just open this up. Get a palette knife. It kind of has a consistency and texture of icing, but don't eat it, of course. It's not going to taste very good or make you feel really good. Put it into your palette just like that. Now make sure that your underpainting is dry. I mean, it can be a little bit wet, but just know that when you put the modeling paste onto your square here, if the modeling paste or if the underpainting is wet, the modeling paste will blend in with the color, which is okay. So you can use your palette knife to paint with this, and the idea behind modeling paste is it's going to give you lots of rich textures when you paint. So sometimes if you paint with really heavy acrylics, you know, when you work with like a blob of acrylic, you can get some textures out of that, but once it dries, it sort of just sinks in. Where modeling paste will dry quite rapidly, and it'll keep that texture, those lovely marks that you make with your palette knife to sort of get that flow. Now I haven't mixed any paint inside this modeling paste, and if I wanted to, I could. All I would do is I would simply take my modeling paste, get a little bit of color on a brush, and just mix it in. I'm going to use my finger. I don't like to get modeling paste on my brushes. I mean, you definitely can, just make sure you wash them really well. But I'm going to mix this in with my finger. I find my finger works really quite well. Just mix it up. And as you can see, as I'm mixing it here, the red paint is kind of going pink because of the white color of the modeling paste. Any color that you mix into the modeling paste, you're going to get that pasteling effect happening because obviously the white is going to influence the color that you're working with, okay? So let's say I wanted to work with this nice mix of red and white modeling paste, and I could work with a flower or something like that, and I want to make this nice texture. Again, you can work with your finger and put it right on top here. Create any kind of technique you want. Let me see, I'll just get some. I like to use my finger a lot. You can use a palette knife, you can use a brush. Create these nice, rich kind of swirl effects. And definitely don't worry about using too much modeling paste. If you want thick texture, I do have a considerable amount of it, and you can sort of see it's got really nice colors to it, right? One thing you can do also is once this modeling paste is dry, you can mix paint in on top of it. I'm going to just do a little bit with the white, and when this dries, I'm going to show you how you can work colors into the modeling paste with a wet wash. So let me just get some of this clean here, and I'll just do some more swirls on this side. That way when it dries, I can demonstrate 2 different techniques. It is important, I think, to cover up or get some paint. You don't want to have raw modeling paste out on your canvas because over time it's gonna turn colors if it's left unmixed. The acrylic paint that's mixed with it will help preserve the color. A little bit of pink in there mixing, but I'm going to live with that. That's going to be okay. But I'm going to show some how to blend these colors in here. So go ahead and work with the modeling paste. Try any texture you want. You can try tapping if you want these kind of You sort of see how that's coming up in little kind of spikes. Experiment as much as you can with the modeling paste and try lots of different textures. You can try the modeling paste or the palette knife. Get these, you know, deeper grooves and stuff like that. You can use your finger to kind of create these little rhythmic, repetitious brush strokes or finger strokes. Just have a lot of fun, do a lot of experimenting with it. And if this little square isn't enough to practice with your modeling paste, go to your sketchbook and try out some more. But let me just sort of leave this as it is, and we'll let that dry, and then we'll come back to it and we'll do some dry brushing on top of it to create some more interesting effects with the modeling paste. Okay, while the modeling paste square is drying, let's move on to technique number 10, blending. We're going to work with an ombre blend where it's alla prima, where it's wet on wet. And then we're going to try also an alla prima, but a different style of blending using broken strokes. So let's just sort of create a line where we're going to be able to compare the ombre with the broken. So I've got my underpainting and it's dry. And you want to probably work with 2 brushes or more when you're working with blending in an ombre. One color for one brush, okay? Then I'll bring it down. And I'll load up the second brush with a different color, and I'm going to bring that up. Okay, let's get started. Choose 2 colors. I'm going to start off with a light purple at the top, and this is alla prima on top of a dry underpainting. Don't get too close to your modeling paste, otherwise that color is going to blend in with it as well. So using this brush, make sure it's nice and wet. Use lots of paint, kind of paint the top section. Put this brush down. Get a second clean brush and put your second color. I'm going to use white. I got lots of paint. And then you choose one brush. Once they get close to each other, then on each other's board, you can either blend with the darker value or the lighter. I mean, you want to make sure that your 2 paints are one darker and one lighter, so you get that nice ombre effect. I'm going to choose to work with my lighter one, and I'm going to bring this up. Later on, I may want to use my darker one just to sort of tighten that up, and I start to blend. And I'm working back and forth, and I'm kind of moving up. I can come down a little bit if I want to bring some of this purple paint down. Working back and forth systematically. Sometimes if I want to bring that darker one down, just blend it in like that, and come right back up and blend. Bring some of the purple down if you want, just to help make the ombre spread out longer. Keep going all the way up. Bring it down a little bit. Keep your brush moving side to side. You can see that it's getting darker towards the top. And if you're not happy with, like, white is very opaque, so it's quite dominant now. It's getting all the way up to the top. If you choose different colors, it may not get up there. But let's say you're not happy with how light the top part is of your ombre. If it's too light for you, bring in your other brush. You don't have any white on this yet. And you start to put some more paint, some more darker purple. I'm going to load up my brush with a little bit more paint over here. Put down that dark, and then again, just ombre that back and forth on its way down. Now, with an ombre, you don't want to lift your brush once it's been loaded with the colors, and then transport it to a different part, because as soon as I touch this part, you know, you're putting purple down there and it spoils the effect of the ombre. So you got to keep it, you know, moving either down and then up. Don't ever sort of jump up and move your brush around, okay? And if this is too dark, bring back your lighter one. It has more of the light paint until you got the desired ombre effect, okay? Now, to do the broken, you want to, again, choose the same 2 colors, something dark, something light. And this time, let's just use some painting strokes. Okay, again, don't get too close to your ombre, or you get some unnecessary mixing. Get our lighter one. Now, the transition looks a little bit too harsh right now, but that's okay. As soon as you start putting paint strokes from the lighter brush into that darker paint, you see how it's starting to kind of ombre, but it looks a little bit broken using these brush marks right here. And if you want to get it lighter, you may have to wash this brush because it's got some darker pigment on there, but I'm going to use a little bit of white on there right now and just sort of see if I can get this lighter color is coming in and transitioning kind of nice. It's quite strong, but you can maybe bring that down a little bit and then take the darker one. Okay, so it sort of ombres from dark to light. Just before I move on to using the sponge, technique number 11, I just want to talk to you a little bit about some other ideas for blending. We used an Alla Prima, ombre, and we did a broken brush stroke sort of thing. But you can also do a lot of blending with other tools, like you can use like the glazing medium that we used in the other tutorial on sheet number 1. You can use that for blending colors together. You could use a sponge to blend the colors together. You could use a dry brush. If you have like something that's dry, try dry brushing a lighter value into a darker tone, and then you can blend those colors. So there's lots of other techniques you can use, and you can combine some of these techniques from this tutorial and the last tutorial, or all these together to combine some really unique marks when you're working with paint. Okay, let's move on to sponge, number 11. Now I have a lot of different varieties of sponges that you can work with. I've got a sponge brush. I've got a sea sponge. It has lots of good texture. This sponge that we were using in the ceramics unit, I've got a couple of these over in the painting area. I've got these triangular sponges, so you can get really tight effects, or you can use the loose ones. Lots of those around. And I have these blending like stampers, large and small. Okay, so just ask me what kind of sponge you want to work with. I'm going to go after a textured effect. So I'm going to choose the sea sponge. And I can compress the sea sponge into a smaller tip. I can expand it. One of the things you want to do when you work with a sponge is you want to be careful that you don't overload the sponge with too much texture. An idea that you could use is get some paint on your brush and put it on your palette or on the newspaper beside you. Spread that out, and then you can use your sponge on top of the newspaper and bring some of it up. Now I've loaded that up with green paint, and when you stamp it down, it might be a little bit too opaque. So keep stamping until you sort of have that textury effect that you want, okay? So I'm just gonna put this around here like that. And you can see that underpainting, the darker tones of the green kind of coming through. So that's the desired effect that I want to have. I want to have that layered effect. Often in painting, it's an art of putting layers of paint on top of each other in a really creative way. So now I'm going to try a little bit of yellow. Put it on my newspaper so I don't overload it. And it's wet on wet, so it's kind of alla prima. I'm just going to add some highlights. So it creates this kind of illusion of texture and depth. I'll try putting in another color just around the edge, just kind of darken that up a little bit. A little bit of blue. The 12th technique I'd like to talk about is soft edges versus hard edges. So for soft edges when you're painting, you don't want to overload your brush. You want to have a little bit a modest amount. You can use the newspaper under your desk to sort of unload the brush. And a soft brush stroke, it's like dry brushing it. It sort of has this feathery kind of effect where it's just covering up the underpainting in a soft, gentle, feathery sort of approach, okay? So if you're painting with a brush that doesn't have a whole lot of paint on it, it's quite soft, and you can use your brush to sort of brush that out and kind of create this feathery sort of effect. Okay, you can practice that a little bit on this area here. So try a few different types of brushes. I really like the way this large number 12 flat worked, using the camel hair. You make sure that you're not trying to, well, I mean, you can feather with one of these synthetic brushes, but they have a lot more hairs, they're tighter packed, and they're better suited for hard edges. Let me show you what I mean. So if you have some of these synthetic brushes, they come in a few different sizes and shapes. We've got some flats and we have some rounds here. So when you're working with them, make sure that you do have a lot of paint. You can actually even add a little bit of water. I just put this into my palette, just dip that into the water a little bit. And a hard edge, when you paint, you'll see it has that really defined line. And you want to make sure that you fill in all these gaps. I sometimes, when I have brush kind of piled up on the bottom there, I kind of press down and just move that to my edge to make that edge even harder. Moving on to technique number 13, impasto. So impasto is a technique used in painting where paint is laid on an area of the surface in a very thick layers. Usually thick enough that the brush or the painting knife, the strokes of the brush are visible in the painting. Paint can also be mixed right on the canvas. When dry, impasto produces or provides a texture, and the paint appears to be coming out of the canvas. Vincent van Gogh painted a lot of his painting using impasto. He worked with oil, but you can work with acrylic, so you can even add modeling paste, which we tried before. Or you can just use some of these tubes of paint that I have. They're heavy-bodied acrylics, so they're thick, and when we paint with them, they go on extremely thick. So you can use some mediums, but you definitely want to make sure that they're thick and you can see the brush strokes when you're painting. Technique number 14 is collage. You can find a lot of different images from magazines. I've got a lot of assortment of magazines for you to choose from. You could work from newspaper, find an image from the newspaper. You could draw a piece in your sketchbook, cut that out, and then collage that into your painting. I found an image of a car that I liked from the Time magazine, and I just simply cut it out. I didn't take a whole lot of time to cut it out. I wanted to leave a little bit of the background that from what it came from. I'm going to paint that sort of into the picture. So I kind of cut it out really quite quickly with a pair of scissors, and I'm going to collage it on. To collage it on to my to collage this on to my picture, I'm going to use this gloss gel. If you don't like the glossy look of this gloss gel, you can use the matte medium, because it won't give you the shine, okay? But I'm going to use the gloss gel. I'm going to open this up and use a palette knife. Please make sure when you're using the gloss gel that you don't get your paint into the gloss gel, because if you do, the gloss gel will take on this color. So try and keep it as clean as you can, and put a clean palette knife or brush into the gloss gel when you're working with it. It doesn't matter to me that I have a little bit of this blue streak into my gloss gel. I'll just incorporate it into my collage. So I get a brush and I apply some gloss gel down onto the surface so I get it wet. And I don't mind that blue on there. I'm just going to work that into the collage picture. I'm going to put a little bit of this gloss gel on the back of this magazine clipping that I found. Make sure you paint the edges. Now I've got gloss gel going on the back of wet gloss gel. Might want to smooth that out, make sure you get all the air bubbles out. I'm going to put a little bit of gloss gel on top, sort of collage that in. I can use a little bit more of this blue paint now, and I can paint with some blue, get that into my picture. And there you go. You can see I could probably spend a lot more time developing this, but you can sort of see where I'm working the collage into the painting, and I'm using some, some of the other techniques that I've taught you. I've used graffito, I've used some of that modeling gel, some blending, some, impasto painting there to create some texture strokes. I mean, you can just keep working on this until you're happy, but I don't want to bore you in this video, but that's basically how collage works. And you can do multiple collages. You could have a collage pictured on top of this one. You just do layers and layers. Collage can be really handy if you don't think you have the ability to paint an object as difficult as a car, then you can just use collage. Technique number 15 is wet on wet. It's not going to be like alla prima though. It's not going to be thick and mixing. We're going to try and make the acrylic much like a watercolor, so we can do graduated washes and stuff like that. So make sure that your water cup is clean. If you haven't cleaned your water cup yet, go and clean it out. You want to have nice clean water so you can have nice clean blends of color. So on your tray, mixing tray, you got your paint. Put some onto your palette, and it's pretty thick. And then go to get some water, start loading up your palette with lots of water. Okay, start loading this up. You can sort of see how translucent that is. I often talk about paint being in consistency of like different types of food. I talk about tea, and what I'm working with right now is a very wet type of consistency of paint. It's like a tea. It's very translucent. When we're working with impasto, it would be like a butter, a really thick butter. And then if you were working with the, when you're doing the blending mediums and stuff like that, it's kind of like a gravy where it's still a little bit runny, but it's not as thick as impasto like when you're working with butter. So here I'm just doing wet on wet, and you can sort of see how the underpainting is really important here. Blending this in. It's another way of blending too. Remember we were doing the work with ombre and the broken technique. And I said you could use dry brushing, you could use a sponge for blending. Well, you can use wet on wet for blending as well. You can sort of see how this is transitioning in here. I'm going to try a little bit of white. And white is always full of lots of chalk, so it's usually traditionally and by its properties quite opaque, but let's try and get this to be translucent as well. If you have too much water on your canvas, just dry your brush, either on your apron or newspaper. And just like acrylic paint, this will dry off really quite quickly. You can sort of see how it's like glazing as well when you use water. So it's got those really thin, you can sort of see how the white mixed with the red, and I've got this pink going over top of the yellow, so it's really quite transparent. And it's like if you don't have glazing medium, I mean I got lots in the classroom, but let's say you're working over the summer or something and you don't have it, you can glaze just by using water. And these are like glaze layers, so it's like the consistency of tea, the tea that you drink, and let them dry. And then I could do another color on top of this as well to sort of get another graduated wash, going from dark to light and wet on wet. It's treating the acrylic paint like it's watercolor. Drips and spatters. When you're working with wet paint, it lends itself really well to drips and spatters, and if you're doing something really expressive, drips and spatters can really add an interesting texture and effect to your painting. So again, I'm just going to put on some paint straight off my palette. I'm not going to add water to it just yet. Okay, now I can add some water. It sort of pools up on the canvas. Blend it in a little bit so it's not too opaque. I'm not not too translucent. And then you just pick up your canvas and you let it drip. If you need to add more water to create more drips, then you just... And if I tilt my canvas straight up, it's going to drip more, but if I put it flat, right like this now, those drips will dry exactly where they are. I think I might want to have them come down a little bit more, so I'm just going to lift up my canvas to a higher angle, and they run down. I think I'm going to take some of the paint out of this strip, just absorb some of the paint here with my brush, wipe it off just on the surface, get rid of that. And I'm going to allow, by getting rid of some of the water that was above this drip here, it will allow the other drip to run further because it's got more moisture. See, I wanted that one to be a different length of a drip. I mean, I could let that drip right off my canvas if I want, but I think I'm going to just leave it like that. And if I'm not happy with how translucent this looks, I could just take some thick black paint and just paint that in. You know, just paint it in like this, make it look more opaque. I kind of actually like seeing that green underpainting underneath there. I might let these drips dry, and then maybe I'll apply some other black drips to give it a little bit more variety. I might make the next drips a little bit more translucent, so not as much paint and more water. And I'll maybe speed up the video right now and so you can actually see that. Okay, so what I'm doing right now is I'm just adding some more water in here. Just want to get a few more drips. They're going to be a little bit more translucent. I'm going to try and create some splatter. I'm just going to take my finger and I'm going to flick my brush right over top of it. See how I'm getting some spattering? I'm just flicking my brush like this, getting some spatters. Okay, one of my favorite tools to use when I'm spattering is to show you where that's at in the classroom. You come back to the acrylic table and you'll see where I keep the sponges. I got rollers, I got larger brushes there. Please help yourself to some of these tools that I have. I've got some paint pens if you want some really hard edges. These are the bellowers right here. When you get one, you want to just make sure that you can compress it. It's got some air. And when you mix your paint, you want it to be a little bit more runny. So you look up here just above the sink and you find one of these cups. You take one of those so you can mix your paint in with some water. Like I was saying when I was demonstrating the wet on wet, getting the right consistency of paint is really important when you're doing something expressive like spatters and drips. So you want to make sure that you're working with something that is like I said before, there's 3 main types of consistencies that I talk about in class, and I use food analogies so that it helps you remember them. When we think of paint like butter, it's that heavy bodied paint that's used for impasto, so it's really thick and like butter. Something in between butter and tea that I was using here was really wet, or like the wet on wet tea like one is gravy. Now gravy can be thick and it can be a little bit runny, so there's always a little variation of the consistency. But if you remember those 3 things, tea where it's really quite translucent, gravy where it's really quite butter where it's really quite thick, and then gravy that's somewhere in between. When you work with this bellower, you want your paint to be a little bit like gravy. Now I'm going to show you how to make that. Get a little bit of paint from your palette. I use my brush and I scoop a little bit into this cup. You can sort of see how I've got a little bit of paint in there. Now I need to start adding some water. So I'm going to take my water cup and I'm just going to scoop it in a few drips at a time, because I want it, this paint right now is quite buttery. It's really thick, and I want to make it like the consistency of gravy. So you put a little bit in there and you start mixing this up. You don't want to have too much water, because if the paint is too wet, when you do your spatters, they're going to be too transparent. And sometimes when you spatter, you want sometimes you want the drips to be transparent, but other times you want them to be a little bit opaque. Okay, so I kind of like the consistency of this now. You can sort of see it moving around. You know, it's runny. It's like gravy, okay? So I'm going to put this brush down. Now I'm going to pick up my bellower, and I'm going to stick the nozzle inside that running part. Oops, that was a little bit... Someone didn't clean this bellower out properly, and you see it's a little bit pink now. It doesn't really matter to me. So by compressing the bellower, it sucked up some of the paint in there. Now when it's in here, all the gravity is moving that paint back to the tip. So when I first go to spatter, it's going to come out in like these bubbles and drips. And all I really want to have are those sort of speckles. You see them there? So I'm kind of just moving my thumb really quite gently like this to get those speckled effects, speckly effects. So again, the first one can go over top of your tray, and then when you're ready, you can bring it on top of your painting. You see those speckles effects? This is why I really like the bellower. I mean, if you want to, give it some time, let that paint run into the spout. It's all pooling up in right there. And if you want to have a splat, you can definitely do that. It's not an effect that I really desire when I go to get the bellower. I'm looking for those speckles, those really rich speckles like that. They can create a really interesting effect in your painting, okay? Another way to get this, if you don't have a bellower, is to take your brush, pull it back, and let the brush sort of flick the paint like that, okay? Another way to do some really interesting effects is to load up your brush, load it up with the paint, put your finger out, wind up, and you get some bigger spatters. Just be careful, because it kind of gets all over the place, and make sure you're not working beside someone that doesn't want to have or won't appreciate getting speckles on their work. I kind of like the way those speckles sort of landed on my collage. Makes it look kind of interesting. Okay, have some fun with some drips and spatters, and the technique part of this this unit is now over. Okay, just before I go, I just want to show you how to clean the bellower. We took in some whitish pink paint into the bellower, and we got to clean this out. Otherwise, it's going to plug up the hole, or the person just that didn't wash this out really well before I used it will get a surprise and an unfortunate color that they don't want to have. So what we do is we go to the sink, get some clean water, shake it around in the bellower, and then in the sink, not into your cup, into the sink, you spit out all that color that you have in there. You do this about 4 or 5 times with clean water from the sink. I'm shooting it back into here. Maybe I'll use my other cup here. And you keep shooting it out until the water that's coming out of your bellower is clear. Take some clean water, give it a shake, clean off the tip a little bit too, and shoot that into the sink until this thing starts shooting out clear. So when the water, you can sort of see that still has a little bit of white in it, so you got to keep washing that out. But when it starts bellowing out clear water, then the bellower is clean.